hospitals, for-profit higher educational institutions, and online outsourced marketplace vendors who are offered as alternatives to public goods and services. More efficient management, steeped in business practices, use of more flexible labor forces, outsourced or part-time, and emphasis on organizational and administrative innovation and disruption. That was that one. Proposition 5, the starvation of public agencies and relocation of public resources to privatized experiments results in dramatic disinvestment in poor and working class citizens of color, effectively defining these populations as disposable. And finally, Proposition 6, as wealth and income gaps grow and uneasiness about potential social and political turmoil spreads, there is an increased public and private investment in surveillance, control, and outright repression and repression. The neoliberal restructuring of public institutions that resulted from these practices was launched initially with the Ford administration's refusal in May 1975 to provide federal support to allow New York City to avoid bankruptcy during the city's fiscal crisis. In rejecting the city's request for federal aid, the Ford administration targeted what it saw as 3 egregious examples of the city's profligate public spending. 1, its unique and far-flung public hospital system. 2, its overly generous welfare support for the city's poor residents. And 3, and most important for our purposes today, its free tuition policy at the City University of New York, which was providing by the mid-1970s higher education for almost 250,000 New Yorkers, rising student tuition charges and student indebtedness, but also in a frantic search by university administrators for ways to cut operating costs. Let's begin with a simple fact. Labor constitutes upwards of 75 to 80% of all university budgets, making labor costs the obvious place to begin to make cuts. To realize that cost cutting, university administrators have reliably drawn on the massive reserve army of the academic under and unemployed to drive down labor costs by replacing full-time faculty with part-time, poorly paid, and exploited adjuncts, the sweated academic labor force of the 21st century. How serious is the contingent labor issue for all universities, but especially for public ones? A 2014 report issued by the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and the Workforce noted that more than 1 million people are now working as contingent faculty and instructors at all types of U.S. institutions of higher education, providing a cheap labor source even while student tuition has skyrocketed, unquote. The AAUP recently released a report that estimated that adjuncts now constituted more than 70% of the entire academic teaching workforce nationwide, nearly 3 out of 4 college teachers. The sharp rise in the use of contingent labor across state university systems, as we have seen in both New York State and Connecticut, as well as obviously everywhere else, is a direct result of reductions in state operating aid. And reductions in state support for public higher education have led to students, particularly poor and working class students of color, increasingly forced to underwrite the escalating costs of their own college educations through family indebtedness. The national total of college student debt now stands at a whopping $1.5 trillion, a figure larger than the total individual and family credit card debt nationwide and trailing only mortgage indebtedness. So where is all the money pouring into public higher education going? Between 1991 and 2011, the number of high-level academic administrators nationally increased by 36%, and the number of other full-time non-instructional professionals grew by 110% in public 2-year colleges. In the same period, the number of full-time faculty grew only 18.5%, while student enrollment increased by 31%. An expanding dual labor market is therefore emerging in public universities. On one track is the growing institutional priority to hire well-paid infrastructural and managerial personnel. On the other is the corporate and neoliberal model of higher education that increasingly relies on a cheap part-time classroom instructional workforce. Upper administrators in public universities are richly rewarded for the neoliberal results they implement. So typical public college presidents in 2018 earned 4.8 times more than their full professors. Many of the good earners who head public universities, to adopt Tony Soprano's useful phrase here, earn much more than the $450,000 mean public university presidential salary. The presidents of the University of Texas system and Texas A&M College Station, for example, earned $2.58 million and $1.89 million in salary, respectively, in 2018-2019. By that academic year, the top 10 public universities in presidential pay compensated their leaders $1 million or more annually in salary. Such gargantuan and obscene public university salaries are justified to boards of trustees or state legislatures by administrators promising to impose ruthless efficiencies in public university operations, by gouging students with ever-increasing tuition, and by underpaying and further exploiting faculty, both full-time and part-time, and by the profligate introduction of various forms of instructional technology. So where do we go from here? I would argue that we need to strengthen organized groups that are already fighting back against this, and we need to build new alliances. Unions, obviously established in information, are at the forefront of this. Alliances with community-based organizations is essential, and new coalitions and alliances, of which I would give several examples: CUNY Rising and the New Deal for CUNY within our own system, AFT and AAUP's New Deal for Higher Education, and Scholars for a New Deal. And I'm happy now to pass the baton to Jennifer Middlestat to talk about the Scholars for a New Deal.
Perfect. And so Jennifer Middlestat is a professor of history at Rutgers, where she studies the history of state and society in the 20th century United States. She's a member of the Rutgers AUP AFT, co-founder of Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education, and sits on the steering committee for the AUP AFT National Campaign for a New Deal for Higher Education. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you. And thank you, Kalina and the Faculty Advisory Committee Conference on Student Success and Shared Governance for inviting me today to talk to you about the possibility for new futures for higher education under siege. And thank you also to the sponsors of this event, who we know are so important, not only for this event, but precisely for the things Steve was just talking about. The affiliates of AUP, SEIU, AFSCME, and AFT. I have to say I'm thrilled to be on this panel with two people whose work I have long admired. I knew about Steve and the American Social History Project, which was like the precursor to the digital history, before I even became a professional historian, and his book, as it was for Dr. Sasanker, is for me, you know, a foundational book on higher ed and the political economy. And Sherry Wolf has been one of our most effective union organizers at Rutgers with me for years, and I'm really honored to share this space with them. So yes, I'm a historian at Rutgers and a member of my formidable union, AAUP AFT union. But I'm here today to represent the organization that Steve just mentioned, Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education. We are a group of teachers and scholars who have spent the past year now researching, writing, and organizing for national reform in higher education. We represent graduate students, contingent faculty, junior and senior tenured faculty, scholars working in public advocacy. And our members are in science, schools of ed, in the humanities, and we come from a wide range of institutions, both public and private, four-year colleges and universities, HBCUs, and national education advocacy organizations. My purpose today really is to build off Steve's framing of the crisis, which was absolutely fantastic. In fact, I feel like I'm probably going to cover some ground that he just covered, but in much less erudite fashion. And I want to talk really about the possibilities of what you all called new futures for higher education. And what Steve's final slide left us with is like, where do we go from here? And I also want to start by recognizing that it's probably pretty likely that any one of you all listening right now could probably lay out for us the problems facing higher education in this current crisis. Just as well, or better, frankly, than I could. I mean, one of the things that I think we're all discovering is that we all really know what the problems are in higher education. We know that they are diverse and many. We know even that some of them vary by region or size of institution, nature of institution. And there might be some, I think there will be, issues that I don't even articulate today that are really important for you all in Connecticut. And I'm hoping maybe, later, the latter panel in the afternoon, we'll take some of those up, or perhaps we can talk about them in the Q&A. What I want to do is sort of walk you through a history of the past year, the year in which my organization, the Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Ed, took shape and began its advocacy. And I want to try to link up the two narratives, the narrative of crisis and also the one of fighting for a new future. Because Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education really is a product of the crisis and trying to use this crisis as a moment to envision a new future. So I'm going to go back just briefly for a second to March 2020. So a little more than a year ago, which was a frightening and confusing time in the world, and also in higher education, as our campuses shuttered and courses moved online. And the press started to write immediately about what they called an impending crisis in higher education because of these changes from COVID. But the secret among all of us who worked in higher ed was that especially those who work in, non-elite, non-private, public institutions of higher learning, crisis was nothing new. I mean, as Steve just pointed out, most public colleges and universities, community colleges have experienced a dramatic decades-long decline in funding. Schools that serve a disproportionate number of low-income students, first-generation students, and students of color experienced the most severe funding cuts. Two-year colleges, branch campuses, and the students they serve have borne the brunt of the suffering. And as these public funding sources were cut over the years, higher education institutions looked to tuition to make up the difference. Steve's figures were incredible. Tuition at four-year colleges increasing almost 200% in the past 20 years. Costs shifting onto students and their families, with the borrowing rates rising astronomically. And it's important to note that Black and Brown students, first-generation students, are taking on the most debt. And like Steve said, it's really staggering. I mean, $1.5 trillion in unpayable education debt right now. And what came next out of this cutback and switch to tuition? Because the funding models were tuition driven, many colleges and university leaders embarked on these sort of competitive hunt for students, a race to attract people to their campuses. Some, like at Rutgers, expending millions on new sports programs, gyms, stadiums, dormitories, food courts, campus and police security. They borrowed tens of millions of dollars and now paid the interest on that debt to the tune of anywhere between 4 and 10% of their annual budgets. The cost of the amenities and the borrowing also were passed on to students and their families in the form of this ever rising higher tuition. And worse, I think, even as they were losing funding and borrowing, most of these institutions used what funds they had to hire a large class of, as Steve just pointed out to us, highly paid administrators to oversee yet more bad budgeting and planning And they did this instead of investing, as you saw, in faculty, instead of investing in librarians, instead of investing in maintenance staff and maintenance and in service employees who make the university run. And the results of this, I think you all know too. At many universities, support staff in housing, maintenance, and food prep were reduced to skeleton crews with contingent contracts, or they were entirely contracted out. Faculty positions took a similar beating. And Steve just showed us that dramatic chart where you could just see the line go straight down. For the past 30 years, the administrative positions at colleges and universities have grown by 60%. It's really like 10 times the rate of tenured faculty positions. And today, only about a quarter of faculty are full-time. And to make things worse, really, the contingent and part-time faculty have seen no real wage growth since the faraway year of 2000. So while colleges and universities, I think in our past, if we think back to before that 1975-76 time that Steve was telling us about, they had at one time been providers of stable jobs with good benefits, but really for the past 30 years now, really, they've been contributing to the growing instability and insecurity of our nation's workforce. So when COVID struck last March, all of these long-term inequities, the instabilities, the poor administrative choices in higher education were exacerbated by the public health crisis and the economic recession that ensued. When COVID hit, colleges and universities immediately faced steep funding cuts from states, which were themselves facing all kinds of new expenses and catastrophic losses in revenue. Very few public institutions or minority serving institutions have significant endowments, but what donations they have are dependent on a volatile stock market, often limited by strict financial agreements and by their boards. Colleges and universities faced declines in enrollment. And as we all know, the federal government, led by Republicans, did not step up to meet the crisis. And meanwhile, COVID caused these intense personal crises for our students. The economic catastrophe means that there's going to be a 20% increase in unmet financial aid going forward. And polls are showing that a majority of students are actually unsure if they'll stay on track to graduate. And for Black and Latinx students, these percentages are even higher, about 80%. And how have college and university leadership responded to the COVID crisis? Well, unfortunately, I think, as you all know, they've mostly responded by doubling down on the practices developed over the past 30 years. So many are continuing to spend money on new amenities and new administrative positions, even as they close departments that they deem superfluous. They're raising tuition, they're borrowing more money from private finance and paying more on their debt. They're protecting what endowments they have rather than spending them. They're cutting secure employment among instructional and support staff. I mean, we joked last spring when our scholars group first formed, we're really laden with a bunch of historians in the group. We joked that the administrators and the board, seemed like a bunch of little, President Herbert Hoovers kind of running around and, making the Great Depression even worse. It's shocking, really, and it's saddening to see that the so-called solutions they're undertaking are really actually deepening economic and racial inequalities and increasing instability in the system of higher ed. So the big question is, what do you do? Last spring and summer, we in the scholars group watched as, really in admiration, as we would see groups of staff and faculty, students, and even whole communities who began resisting their administrators' counterproductive actions. Some institution-based efforts rallied communities to protect a targeted campus or a department that was suddenly marked for closure. Other campaigns were launched by distinct constituencies. So undergraduate students who needed more financial aid, graduate students asking for research funding, extensions, staff unions seeking to postpone or prevent furloughs. And those battles, which I think you yourselves are fighting right now, are continuing. And in some places, as Sherry will discuss in a minute, like my own university, Rutgers, some places we're gaining steam and we're winning. And yet, even as, we admire these responses and we participate in them, we in this group began to search for a coordinated national approach. An approach that sort of fitted some of these separate modes of resistance into a broader vision and a united movement for alternatives for higher education. And, if ever there was a time to fully reckon with the long-term destruction of higher education, we thought has to be now, when we stand really on the precipice of full disaster. So we reached out to colleagues in our networks. We reached out to many different professional organizations, and we reached out to our unions. Our locals, the kind of regional organizers, and also to national AFT and AAUP to ask whether they wanted to be a part of crafting a united movement for a more general reform of higher education, a movement that we thought might help bridge regions and institutions and subsets of campus and community organizations. So as scholars with the historical mindset, we looked to the history of the 30s. And in that crisis, people asked not only what had provoked the crash of 1929, but what the resulting financial implosions suggested about broader failures in the economic and social system. President Roosevelt and his allies, they had to reckon with how to reform those systems. And we know now, looking back, that the New Deal was not a perfect model, really, not even close. And we know that its lack of commitment to gender equality and racial equity actually fostered inequalities that we now find ourselves having to fight today. But I think both its successes and the New Deal's failures prompt us to ask at this historic moment in higher ed, in this crisis, how we could do it better, how we can push our higher education institutions more in the direction of justice, how to bend them sort of more in the direction of economic and social security, more in the direction of accountability, more in the direction of equity, and envision what we often think of as a true New Deal for higher education. And that's the vision that we're trying to carry forward now. So what does it look like? First, it looks like valuing the things we believe are important. Equity for all students, faculty, and staff. Access to the full benefits of employment and education. Democratic governance by the people who actually make our institutions of higher education function. And of course, putting instruction of students and research for the common good first. What does it look like in terms of policy? I'm well aware that there may be more than one way to get to these goals, of course. But what we want to aim for the first time is permanent, direct federal funding of higher education as a true national priority. So what that looks like is direct federal investment aimed mostly at public institutions, but also non-elite, not-for-profit private institutions. But those funds cannot simply be used to support the poor choices that have been made in higher education for the past 30 years. The funding must go to lowering tuition or eliminating tuition for undergraduate and graduate students, fully supporting graduate student funding. I mean, right now we're really looking at protecting losses due to COVID. Maybe more important than anything, converting contingent teaching positions into full-time, long-term employment and retaining all staff and service workers and preventing the contracting out and privatization of this work. We also want to rethink the role of private finance in higher education by considering direct federal loans to higher education institutions that bypass the private sector and the debt crisis in which colleges and universities enter when they borrow from Wall Street. And we support eliminating student debt. So what we've done toward those goals, we convinced the national AFT and AUP to fully take on the campaign. And we are so thrilled to have national partners with us. Right now on the steering committee, we're reaching out to additional unions and other stakeholders to press forward at the national level. We in the Scholars Group, we've also partnered with the Roosevelt Institute to write about the importance of a New Deal for higher education. And we've offered up more specific policies, ideas on these counts. And I think Kalina will put in the chat a link to that paper. We're now currently developing a white paper on what a new deal for higher education could look like in the current infrastructure bill that is taking form right now on Capitol Hill. And we've been working with members of Congress in higher ed, on the Senate side with Elizabeth Warren and on the House side with Ayanna Pressley, both of whom endorsed a new deal for higher education and joined us for the national launch. And we're also currently working to support the College for All bill that Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Pramila Jayapal will release next week, which contains labor protections and a path to tenure for the first time with some guardrails for how that money should be used. And we're also doing this, what I'm doing today. We're working with local unions, local organizations, talking about the project, listening to the amazing ideas that so many people working in colleges and universities, community colleges, trade schools have about how to make these institutions to which we've committed our lives fairer and stronger and more equal. So I am looking forward to learning with you in our Q&A and in our panel this afternoon about what you think needs to be done and how we might all work together to do it. And with that, I'm so excited to now pass it off to Sherry, who will talk about the nuts and bolts of the organizing we all need.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. So Sherry Wolf is a senior organizer of the Rutgers AUP-AFT, the Union of Faculty, Grads, Postdocs, and Counselors. She's a lifelong socialist and organizer against racism, police violence, and US imperialism, and the author of Sexuality and Socialism, History, Politics, and Theory of LGBT Liberation. Wolf became a full-time organizer in 2013 for the union, representing nearly 9,000 scholars and researchers at Rutgers, where she applies her experience as an organized socialist to help develop a fighting member-led union. Thank you, Sherry.
Good morning, comrades, colleagues. Thank you so much to the Faculty Advisory Committee for inviting me. It's lovely to see Stephen and Jennifer here, whom I've only more recently met through her initiative around the Scholars for a New Deal. So let's get kicking. I don't come out of academia, and I don't come out of actually the American labor movement. I was spent my life on the American Marxist left as a card-carrying red, as they say. Just as the left was collapsing, that's when I got involved in the 80s. So what can I say? From the generation nobody ever bothered to name. Let's talk a little bit. I was asked to talk a bit about bargaining for the common good and our own experiences at Rutgers, and then we'll get into some of this discussion, the meat of it. And I guess just a little brief potted history of what we're talking about when we're talking about bargaining for the common good. Basically, the language, the terminology, even if the concept is much older, is probably dates back just a decade or so. And you can sort of identify the first signs of what would become bargaining for the common good around 2010 or so, when we'll give it a start, when around the St. Paul, Minnesota teachers who were fresh out of a bargaining campaign in which they demanded that parents of special needs students be allowed into the bargaining sessions, they began talking about how to involve the community more fully in their bargaining sessions, in their contract campaign. And in Chicago, a circumstance I'm much more familiar with, I was still living in Chicago in the early 2000s and working at Haymarket Books. And my dear friend, Jesse Sharkey, who's currently the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, it was in their backyard in the early 2000s over beer and barbecue, as all good discussions that I've been a part of have been stroked by. I don't mean to offend the vegetarians here. We began to read Shock Doctrine together, a bunch of teachers, and that came to become the Caucus of Rank and File Educators Corps, which in 2012 took power, the Chicago Teachers Union. And the union immediately began laying plans for an innovative bargaining campaign backed up by a credible strike threat when the contract would expire that year. And And by 2011, I guess you could say the Service Employees International Union approved a campaign called the Fight for a Fair Economy, which sought to commit, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars to community organizing efforts among workers who are low-wage workers. And that came to be known as the Fight for 15, right? Jobs for Justice, the National Network of Unions, and community allies joined with the National Domestic Workers Alliance to create Caring Across Generations as a campaign, which was a national initiative to transform the long-term care system and kind of, you know, bring power to empower care workers that would in time unite over 200 organizations. And of course, September 2011, Occupy Wall Street erupted, and that really seeded a new alliance among unions and allies in many cities that led to exposing the sort of predatory nature of financialized capitalism and the brutality of the police. I live in New York City, and as a union member, I'll never forget receiving an emergency text that evening in mid-October of 2011, 4 weeks or so into Occupy, from the New York Central Labor Council calling on me and every other union member in the city of New York to get our asses down to Zuccotti Park by 5 o'clock the next morning to protect Occupy Wall Street. And I did go, along with literally 5,000 other workers, mostly unionized workers, who surrounded our kids in the square and forced the then Bloomberg administration to back down. And we stopped the police from attacking Occupy Wall Street and protected that movement for another month. Into November, something that a lot of people have long forgotten about. That never happened in my life, and was a kind of really good reason to get up at 3:30 in the morning. And then, of course, the 2012 Chicago teachers strike itself, which blazed the way forward. Prior to their walkout, the union had spent 2 years building community relationships, involving community allies, and shaping their own bargaining demands. And the CTU went into the 2012 strike demanding things that weren't permissible in traditional bargaining. That the Chicago public schools would claw back money, and it had lost to these sort of toxic interest rate swaps, that the city used the tax increment financing money to help the schools rather than throwing it away on the Chicago Board of Trade and the Hyatt hotels, that schools provide social services for their students. Hello. All of the goodwill that the union built with parents and other community allies helped it to force the Chicago mayor at that time, Rahm Emanuel, to blink in their showdown with the teacher, and they won a huge victory. Soon many of the other unions began joining with community allies and making demands that reach well beyond the narrow confines of bargaining. I won't go through an exhaustive list, but I'll give you a little taste. California university workers demanded that their employer prohibit the use of riot police and SWAT or excessive police force during nonviolent student and worker actions. New Jersey teachers demanded that school districts hire and support more Black teachers and mandate Black history and ethnic studies in K through 12. San Diego public employees demanded the county reform its criminal justice system to prioritize education and early intervention and treatment and rehabilitation instead of the sort of strictly punitive measures that are basically a school to prison pipeline, and many, many, many others of these kinds of initiatives, too many to list here. So that when the Red for Ed movement erupted in 2018, its demands also transcended the narrow confines of permissible bargaining, right? Keep in mind, the West Virginia teachers refused to end their strike until all of the state's employees received the same raises that they had been promised. Arizona teachers wanted a ballot initiative that would block tax cuts that had defunded their schools. And in North Carolina, you had teachers calling for Medicaid expansion. 2019, I think, was certainly a crescendo with both CTU once again going out on strike, and this time advancing even more aggressive and winning more aggressive social justice demands, right? The nurses in the schools, they went out with SEIU workers who came out with them. UTLA, I went out to LA to just get a whiff of what that strike was like in January of 2019. I mean, you just had UTLA, their walkout called for the hiring of nurses and librarians, an end to the racially targeted searches of their students, dedication of school property to green space, legal support for immigrant families. Obviously, we're talking about Los Angeles here. That's an enormously important demand. All of these things were thrown on the table and were won by militant mass strikes that involved community who came out in rallies and demonstrations by the tens of thousands in both LA and Chicago. So really, I think kind of in taking these stands for innovative and broad-ranging demands, the UTLA and CTU unions were kind of breathing life into a vision that had animated the labor movement at its origins in the early 20th century, and even before. I want to just say a little bit something about Rutgers' experience and what we've been doing, and I'll end on this. We, for a number of years, have been involving ourselves. First of all, we looked around at our own union and said, look, we've got some of the largest contingent of unionized climate scientists in the world are at Rutgers. The people who are authors of the 12 Years to Live are in our union. And we've got students who are agitated as they should be about their own futures. And we began to organize alongside of them and community folks in Sunrise and 365.org to fight and organize around climate strikes. Our union endorsed the Green New Deal, then got the national and pushed for the national AFT, which now itself also endorses the Green New Deal. Rutgers is now the first state university, to my knowledge, that has divested from fossil fuels. That is just this year. And we are now trying to get this to broaden that effort and expand on what we've already won. Around DACA and immigration, we have been, fighting alongside the students and communities. Keep in mind, Rutgers exists in two large Black working class cities, Newark and Camden, one of the poorest cities, if not the poorest city in the United States, and New Brunswick, where the quote unquote flagship, or the largest of the campuses exists, is a largely Latino population with an enormous number of undocumented working class people. And we've thrown ourselves into fights that have to do with community demands, like defending a school, Lincoln Annex, which is currently being destroyed to build a cancer institute, basically for money. Short answer, capitalism. And we got involved with our students and community and members to fight in this defense. We haven't won these. It's not like we win all these battles. We don't. We put them on the table, but it has helped form coalitions and groupings of people that aren't going to go away, and a level of street cred and trust and collaboration among immigrant workers who live in the communities where we work as well, and has led us into a new venture of studying what is the impact of Rutgers' extraordinary costs of housing for students on the communities that also have their rents driven up right around. And this exists in every university where there is residential, it drives up the housing costs for all of the people living there. How do we place those demands in our upcoming contract campaign on driving down housing costs in the areas where, in the communities where our campuses are located? Incarceration, Rutgers is a small city, like a lot of state universities, 100,000 people, right? 70,000 students all told, from wall to wall, undergrad and grad, and another 30,000 or so workers. We started to say, well, wait a minute, we teach inside of the prison system, yet people, if they want to get employed by the university, have to tick a little box, say that they've never gone, why? How do we change the rules of the game to actually accommodate what the needs of the community and our own members really are? Even the innovation of a freedom school to Jennifer's colleague and comrade in the history department, Donna Murch, historian of the Black Panther Party, has innovated at our union, has brought together voices to talk about things like, how do we sort of use the SNCC model, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee model, in our own union and in our communities to actually deepen the level of politics, develop a cadre among students and union activists, of leaders who are thinking politically and historically about not only what's happened as a sort of enlightening, experiment, but actually how do we implement some of the things that we're learning about. And as a result of this, our union has taken a stance to shut down the Essex County ICE Detention Center and are involving our members and students in activism around that. In short, I think we have to understand that BCG, bargaining for the common good, social justice unionism, whatever you want to call it, really, it's not a shiny extra for well-resourced unions. It's about an approach to bargaining and labor organizing that takes on the broader social needs of our members and the communities that we serve. The union leaders who worry about a BCG approach driving away members and leading conservatives to bolt from their unions, I think are actually taking a very backward approach to looking at the role of labor unions and our own role as leaders. If we concede to the intolerable status quo, then we're part of the problem. And our job is actually to lead. Our experience at Rutgers has been that when our union became more vocal and active around immigrant rights, around fighting under Trump in particular, the Muslim ban, and all of these wider social issues, taking on and incorporating and bringing in Black Lives Matter activists and students as well as faculty into this allowed our union to become a magnet for people who had often felt maybe they were members of the union, but they weren't active in the union. They didn't see their union as being particularly relevant to their week-to-week life, and even if they paid their dues as loyal union members too. But we found a complete shift, a complete changeover in the leadership of the union and the activist base of the union, and actually helped us build a solid, much more solid shop stewards network, or what we refer to as department reps network, because it meant that people who, thought that unions were good maybe, or maybe had no opinion about unions at all because they've grown up in this country and like most other people have only experienced labor defeats or just had profound ignorance because it's simply not taught or thought much about, began to think about our union as not only a shelter in a storm during the course of the pandemic, but a place, a platform in which to organize and actually transform things. So we've actually went from having a leadership and a somewhat sclerotic membership that was largely older, whiter, maler, to having a much younger, more multiracial, women led and people of color, and people who are in more precarious positions of the professoriate, who are the vision, who have to be shaping a vision for a future, rather than talking about what existed 30 years ago in the professoriate. We have to position ourselves to fight what is going to be the future of higher ed. And those are people who are in much more contingent circumstances. So that's really what has been our experience. I think unions that worry about how to build and workers who worry about how to build more diverse leadership and attract people who want to do something to make change have to think seriously about bargaining for the common good. This has been essential, I think, for our own union's growth and development of women and people of color leadership, and really once younger and more precarious and queer and Black and brown and immigrant workers see leaders who look like them in positions of leadership, taking stances that connect with their needs, it draws in the next layer of activists and people with vision and a desire to organize. It's not simple, but it's true. And I guess I would end by saying, I think bargaining for the common good is about returning to labor's fighting and more visionary roots of workers' control and solidarity. It's a rejection of the notion that our lives and our families and the things that we love and care about have nothing to do with our jobs and our workplaces. I think if anything, this pandemic has probably ended for all time the separation of from work and home. Millions of us have been working from home. We've now discovered that we're sort of living at work. Really, I think for decades, the unions that became sclerotic and top down and corporatized bureaucracies have to really take a blunt look at what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And I think our job as union activists and as leaders is to transform our unions into schools of struggle and vehicles for economic and social transformation through solidarity. It is quite literally the only way for our members to win and for us to have a broader impact in the societies in which we live and work.
Thank you, Sherry. All right, so I'll begin with some questions, but I just have to say that, I think many of us have been feeling, one, that we're in a moment of crisis, and two, that the responsibilities of sort of fulfilling the mission of being educators in public higher ed is just so expansive, right? It extends out to the streets, it extends out to politics, and that can be exhausting sometimes. And I just love that this kind of conversation makes it feel different, right? It's inspiring because we're in a moment to be seized. So I really appreciate everything we're hearing here. And I think I'll start with this question. Can you talk about the relationship between shared governance and faculty unions and how those groups can work in greater unison? Everyone's passing it off.
I mean, I'm happy to, but yeah, go ahead, Jennifer. Why don't you?
No, I want you to, Steve, because I mean, honestly, I think the experience, your experience at CUNY for many years and the things that are happening now at CUNY probably make this really, relevant for you. You probably have a fair amount to say about this.
I do. I mean, I've been at CUNY 41 years, and as I said to Jennifer in the chat, this is my last semester. I'm finally riding off into the sunset. But, I've had a lot of time to think about this, and I would say there needs to be, they exist on parallel tracks in our institution, and rarely are they in coordination. I think the union needs to play a much more active role in reaching out to the faculty governance organization, in our case, the University Faculty Senate, which has got a very old school way of thinking about their role. They have a representative non-voting on the board of trustees, and they, it's a token kind of process. Campus-based faculty governance is stronger. And, I also teach it, I didn't mention this, I also teach at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, our newest campus of CUNY. And one of the things that we insisted on from the outset when we created as a new school, strongly oriented toward labor unions in the city, obviously, and that's who our student population is we wanted a strong Personnel and Budget Committee, which is one of the sort of the key ways in which you keep the administration honest. And I was elected chair of that. And so on top of everything else, I'm trying to kind of balance my several roles as a faculty member, as a union member, and as the chair of the P&B. And I think what we need to do is sort of engender a much more vigorous conversation about how these two different sort of institutional groupings can and should work together, not just to speak about faculty interest, which is one of the things I worry about with faculty governance, but as Sherry has really pointed us to, we only are going to succeed if we have an intersectional movement that is much bigger and speaks to much bigger issues than workload and salary, which is what our unions tend to think about and what faculty governance tends to be about. And I think if we don't move to something bigger and broader, which is, I'm a labor historian, and my understanding of when the labor movement has been successful historically is precisely at the moment when it speaks for the whole, not for the individual members of its union alone. It has to do both, but we can't we can't move forward unless we pay attention to that larger question. So coalitions with students are essential. That's what we're trying to do with CUNY Rising. That's what we're doing with the New Deal for CUNY, is building ties, just learning from the Chicago model in 2012. Why did they win? They won because they, as Sherry told us, 2 years before, they were building ties to the community. And when you looked at the picket lines in Chicago in 2012, who was on the picket lines? It was union members, but it was also families and students, with the great line, you know, our teachers' working conditions or our learning conditions. How can you beat that? That's what we've got to do in public universities, and building ties to, you know, to faculty governance is important, but a difficult sort of process in my experience.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think that this sort of gets to the heart of some of the questions that we're asking about, like, sort of, how do you take, so even in our case, advocacy for direct federal funding of higher education, how do you make it go to the right place, right? How do you make it do the work that needs to be done, and not just do the work of sort of further crippling the instructional staff, the research agenda, the support and maintenance staff? How do you do this? And, you know, I think that we probably need to think on multiple levels about accomplishing this. I think if we are really thinking big, you know, what you think about the possibilities that might exist, both at the kind of campus level and bringing together, closer together, your union and your faculty governance, but also working with, as we've said, with staff and students to think maybe not only about faculty governance, right, but college governance, university governance that brings in the interests of other people who are there. You have to build those ties. You have to do what Sherry said, and you have to start putting things on the table for bargaining that aren't normally on the table for bargaining. You want to bargain the budget, like the use of the actual budget, the whether or not loans will be taken from Wall Street. You put things on the table that you haven't put on the table before. But you also, I think, have the possibility to think about tying strings through either the regulatory process that exists in existing disbursements for higher education at the state level, but also what we're asking for is federal funding with strings attached legislatively, like at that moment. And those strings attached just immediately narrow the possibilities for what that money can be used for. So in a way, sort of introducing the notion of real full community governance, but at the top from the start, so that you're not fighting it out at over every single annual budget or something like that. So I think there's a number of different possible ways to think about where to direct our organizing, our attention, our focus.
Look, I'm actually going to be heading out of here by noon to meet with a bunch of faculty who have just voted overwhelmingly, as Jennifer knows, because she's one of the people who voted, to furlough themselves in part by 10% over the next 2 months or something, 3 months, in order to stop layoffs. We have a signed guaranteed stopping of all layoffs of staff jobs through 2022, getting extended grad funding. We won back our raises, by the way, that we lost over the, you know, so blah, blah, blah. So we forced the university to do something it didn't want to do. Number one, it had to sit there with blue collar and white unions representing multiple unions at the same time. They always said we will never do that. Well, they did that. And we are now bringing staff and students to the table, like we need to be part of the governing, you know, on the board of governors. We need reps, and it needs to be real and not just some little bullshit committee that goes in a corner and has a conversation and then the deciders make it. We're gonna have to fight for these things. We forget. I mean, Stephen knows because he's written a book about it, but like public sector unions weren't legal. They weren't legal. When I was born, they weren't legal, okay? So we all think about public sector as being so unionized. It's like, it's not. But comparatively to how did it happen? People broke the law. Now, I'm not saying that, therefore we have to go out there and break the law. I mean, ultimately, we are going to have to go out there and break the law, especially in New York where there's jail law. It's going to have to be broken. But it's just going to have to be broken. It's going to have to be broken. It's going to have to plan for breaking it, not just, stupidity. But that is the kind of thing we're going to have to go beyond the bounds of what they allow. And I think that this last year has been kind of a moment when we can kind of open up our minds to the possibility of it. I mean, let's face it. When have any of us, there's probably nobody on this call that was ever alive, when would they ever started spending trillions of dollars on any kind of social anything in this country? Suddenly, the money tree starts shaking. I'm sorry, I do not believe it's the senator from the state of credit card that has suddenly had a change of heart after 40 years of being in office. No, it's because the largest explosion in the history of the United States hit the streets just a few months ago, led by young Black and brown people. And you've got the severity of the crisis and workers in sometimes feeble ways, but nonetheless trying to find ways of, people doing walkouts and all sorts of actions. This is unprecedented. Things are happening, not just from above, but from below, and they're having to respond. And I just think we have to sort of scale that down to what our particular circumstances are at our schools to figure out what that's going to look like.
I just taught my labor history class last night for School of Labor and Urban Studies, and we were talking about the New Deal and the Wagner Act. And one of the things we said, picking up on Sherry's point, is as wonderful as the Wagner Act was, and how much we'd love to get back to the Wagner Act and get rid of Taft-Hartley, which is what's the legislation that's proposed. You don't get a Wagner Act without mass strikes of workers the year before the Wagner Act is passed. It's the mobilization of working class people that pushes the New Deal and pushes Congress and ultimately enforces the courts to accept the very idea of union organizing. Being officially recognized by the government. So it's absolutely about a mass movement. We have to have that in order to push the powers that be to make the concessions. We've just had the best budget and result for CUNY in probably 10 years, in part because our awful governor is on the ropes because of his horrible sexual harassment, charges, and because of how he screwed up the nursing home situation with COVID. And so his weakened position and the increase in the number of real progressive legislators who've come in at both the Assembly and the State Senate have allowed for the best budget we've had at CUNY. It wasn't everything that the union asked, but in fact, it was as good as it was, not because the Board of Trustees did anything, not because the CUNY administration did anything, but because the members of the union went up along with students and CUNY Rising and the New Deal for CUNY to fight like hell to get more funding. So it's always about mass movements. It's always about sort of taking it to the streets and into the legislative chambers and the governor's mansion if we can.
All right. Next question. So could you please explain what you mean by equity for all students? And what does that look like? That term has been used in many different ways to accommodate almost anything these days. So could you say a little bit more about what that might look like?
I'm assuming that was for me, maybe because I had laid that out. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really an astute question, and the comment about how much the term equity can be used by people who have very different aims from our own. Like, that's a caution well taken. I mean, our particular commitments come from the kind of historical analysis that, Steve and Sherry are doing of the labor movement, but from thinking about, for me, from the welfare state and the New Deal, right? I mean, the New Deal was not a deal for most Americans, and that's the truth of the matter.
Right.
It was not a deal for women, and it was not a deal for most people who are not white, whose locations in the labor market and whose identities were assumed not to need to be covered. And so coming from an analysis where we think about racism, the institutionalization of racism in state institutions, and sexism and its institutionalization also. I mean, our primary understanding of equity is sort of thinking about, if we ask the question, what does this university, this college, this community college, this system do for a first generation African American woman? We're asking the right question about whether it's producing the outcomes that we need it to produce. Is it valuing her her personhood, protecting her while she's there on campus and in class, serving her needs? Is it not putting her in an unpayable debt situation? Is it providing some hope for economic security in the long term through the education and skills that she's getting? I think coming from that's where we come from in that point of view. I think active in the same way that we need to confront, challenge, fight about things like the budget, we have to confront, challenge, and fight about things like racial and gender equity, and equity for our students who are first generation and queer. And we need to confront all of those failures that we see on our campuses and in our institutions in multiple forms when we see them. So for us, that's an analysis, that's a place where we start in our analysis, a useful question that we ask ourselves about the policies that we're looking at. And I think it's been helpful.
Right. And did anybody else want to speak to the issue of equity? Or should we move on to the next question?
Let me just make one point in addition to what Jennifer just said, which is that what we don't want to do is fall into the liberal trap of talking about equity as simple representation. So we're counting numbers, which is the sort of the liberal bureaucratic way of dealing with equity. Equity has to deal with something that's systemic. So what we know now, exactly the way Jennifer is talking about, is the New Deal made these horrible compromises with Southern Dixiecrats in order to get the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act passed. And in order to do that, they excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Well, figure out who the agricultural and domestic workers were in the 1930s. You don't need to have a PhD. It's just common sense. So the people that were excluded were blacks and women, and in the West, Latinx people, mostly Mexican Americans in that period. And so what does that lead to? It leads to a systematic underaccumulation of wealth by those same populations. And so you get the GI Bill, which makes education available to white workers and access to low or relatively free mortgage payments for houses in the suburbs. African Americans are barely allowed access to that, so wealth doesn't happen. So what we need to do when we think about equity is deal with something compensatory that really speaks to these historic problems that the country has never addressed. And we're not going to do that by simply counting numbers and doing representation on a spreadsheet.
And we have to remember that the institutions that have suffered most over the past 30 years this started to happen precisely when Black and brown students started entering these colleges and universities, and also started entering into staff and faculty. And so what we're looking at is this, convergence of the neoliberal undercutting of these institutions precisely when these people are entering these institutions, and it's a disaster. And it can't be allowed to happen. So most of what we're looking at and fighting for aims at helping precisely these institutions, which are doing the work in educating the majority of first generation and Black and brown students.
As we like to say at CUNY, it was free for 130 years. And then in 1970, when Black and brown students pushed like hell to open admissions to really change, Brooklyn College was 96% white in 1968. Let that statistic sink in for a minute. Brooklyn College was 96% white. So students went into the streets and onto the campuses and took control in 69. We have open admissions in 1970. University expands to 250,000, almost doubles its population. Black and brown populations expand dramatically in the first years of that decade. And then boom, 1976, the fiscal crisis comes and free tuition is gone, never to return. It's not a coincidence.
Thanks. So that brings us, I think, naturally to a question. That is, could you define neoliberalism for those who are kind of new to the concept, and talk about when these kinds of policies really took root and why states are so committed to them?
Well, that's what I tried to do in my presentation. So what's neoliberalism in one fundamental way is the demonization of the public sector and the demonization of and the argument for privatization of all kinds of public resources. So public goods aren't really public goods; they need to be privatized and made and given over to the private sector. What I tried to suggest was that this date. Somebody to mute.
Yeah, okay.
It dates from literally this imposition of tuition at CUNY in 76. We tend to date neoliberalism from Reagan breaking the PATCO strike and privatizing that union, but in fact it was 5 years earlier that the opening shot was there. And then there are all kinds of ways in which neoliberalism does this, through metrics, through sort of evaluating the ways in which the public sector is inefficient and making the argument. Think of charter schools. Charter schools can do better with it than public schools. So we use public funding, and that's the rub there, to fund charter schools, which are essentially private and have no controls, and certainly rarely are they unionized. So each state has taken this sort of process further and further. What I didn't talk about in my presentation, but something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is the ways in which administrators use educational technology and the way they basically reach out to outside firms to impose educational technology on public universities is a perfect example of a neoliberal solution to an educational problem.
Can I say something just as an addendum to what Stephen was saying about the question of neoliberalism? Because I have no disagreements with anything Steve said, and I think the economics of neoliberalism, right? Cut to the bone, privatize everything, the public is evil, et cetera, are accurate. I think Henry Giroux introduces another aspect of the neoliberalization, neoliberal war on higher ed, I think is the title of his book, where he talks about the ideological aspects of it. And I think he hits on something that helps me understand something about the destruction of the humanities and social sciences, or at least the way that budgeting models from one university to the next go after them, and how the neoliberal assault on higher ed has had a particularly vicious impact. It's had different kinds of impact in STEM, because that's being now, government money, military, blah, 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 blah. Researchers turned into small business people who run little labs. But in the humanities, it's also been an attack on analytical thinking, historical knowledge, right? The stuff that Jennifer and Steve teach is dangerous, because it helps people dream, because it allows you to think about a world different from the way it is, and imagine that the frame, that the intolerable status quo we're living in is not sort of, didn't just sort of, isn't natural. And interestingly, they don't even, bosses don't even agree with this kind of assault. Every survey that has been done over the last many years, about what people who are employers are looking for in, students, like capacity for analytical thinking, knowledge of history, capacity for communications, writing skills, all of the things that humanities teachers teach, but these are come at the expense of being more disciplined and, line up in size order, toes on the line, follow the rule. And, if you want to have a society of rules followers who have their imaginations and dreams smashed and no concept of history and have, a diminished knowledge of philosophy and all, history, English, literature, all the rest of culture, languages are like the first thing to go. We only bomb these countries, we don't teach the languages that they speak. So there's an ideological function to this as well in higher ed. It's really pernicious and we have to, challenge the logic of.
And beyond higher ed, I would say, if one thinks about the ways in which Silicon Valley uses notions of disruption as a way to kind of undermine kind of ways of typical inquiry. One of the reasons that Mike and I title our book Fighting for the Soul of Public Higher Education is the thing that I feel most strongly about is that higher education is not about job creation. It's not about simply going out and figuring out how you can get the best paying job after you get whatever degree you're going to get. It's also about thinking critically, all the things that you were just describing, Sherry. And that's the thing that, unfortunately, when the neoliberal regime gets imposed, it's all about metrics that say, how quickly do you get your degree and how quickly do you go out and become a tax-paying citizen? And, even people who are well-intended about public universities speak in that language. We need to take back the idea that an education is something more than just getting a job.
I'd like to point out, though, too, we have some real natural allies here, and we have an incredible advantage right now. If we think about the pervasiveness of what we might call this neoliberal agenda, I mean, I studied the military, and you think higher education is privatized. You ought to look at the military. NASA is 90% privatized. The Department of Energy is 90% privatized. The Department of Homeland Security, which did not exist until we were already well into a neoliberal governance regime, was never public. There are natural allies that we have all over who do not think that market solutions that were promised to address problems that might have existed or problems that didn't exist, right? Those people do not think that privatization and corporate market solutions have worked well in their environments either. And I have been surprised at the degree to which, when I have gone around to military audiences and talked about privatization in the military, how many of them agree that it has produced negative consequences. And those negative consequences are not only for in our area of soul, the very things that neoliberalism promised to save money, to be more efficient and effective. It has spectacularly failed.
Yeah.
And it has spectacularly failed because the job of the private sector, as we see in borrowing in higher education, is to make money, is to take profit. And if you take profit, you make bad contracts because the private corporations or banks, they want their money and they want as much money as they can get. So if you look at any of the contracts in the military, they are, by any measure, they are bad contracts. The contracts for the stuff that Steve is talking about, the technology contracts in higher ed, if you read them, they are bad contracts. They are contracts that do not deliver well when things need to be troubleshooted. Usually you buy the bottom of the barrel in terms of what that contract is. So it doesn't have a lot of flexibility and applicability in the classroom for people who have to use it. It switches every year because they're trading off with contractors year after year. So everybody has to reinvent the wheel and the costs to the retraining are enormous. There are additional costs that, if something takes a little bit longer, it's not on the back of the private sector firm, right? We have a lot going for us in thinking about who are our allies, who we can talk to, the ways that the grounds on which we can critique the decisions that have been made to privatize in higher education and to defund that are very real. And when we think about who we work with, how we work with them, the way that we discuss what has gone wrong, we need to call this on the carpet because it's really bad outcomes. It's not just different outcomes from the one we want. They're poor outcomes that didn't fulfill their own promises.
Amen.
It takes work. You have to research it. You have to look at the contracts. You have to do the work, but who better than we to research it?
That's right. So I think you have very much sort of addressed this, but I wonder if there is a little bit more you want to say about this specifically, because there was a question in the chat about why management seems to look more to consultants than to this team of experts that they have hired as faculty and staff. So is there anything specific you want to say about the sort of consulting culture of higher ed?
I will just say one quick thing that I think is illuminating. I'm not an expert in higher education. I don't study higher education. I just work in higher education. And the reason why I'm doing all this is not because I'm an expert. It's because my back was to the wall, which is I think why most people finally, get up and do something. I mean, I feared that the institutions to which I had devoted my entire life, in which I loved, were going to be destroyed, right? So I didn't know very much about it, and I've learned a ton. And one of the things that I have learned that I can't believe that I didn't know was that in order that all public and private universities are bond rated and credit rated by Moody's. You can't borrow as an institution or a system if your bond rating is poor. And how is your bond rating measured? And what gives you a poor one? One of the number one factors hidden in the details is whether you have unions on your campus. So in other words, why do they look instead to consultants? Why do they not look to you? In part, it's because they fear that their bond ratings, they fear that their access to private sector credit, they feel that their access to finance will decrease if they support the very people who make their campus run. So the more tenure track jobs you have on your campus, the lower your credit rating, the percentage, right? In addition to the more union members you have, the lower your credit rating. The less contracting you do to the private sector of your staff, the lower your credit rating. With the lower credit rating, you can't do these things. So financial consultancies, legal firms that are experts in elbowing unions out the door and in pushing, poor contracts, they get the voice. They are the voice that boards and universities listen to. And for me, that was a real education over the course of this last year, to just know how much the deck is structurally stacked against us with the importance of private finance and private dollars in higher education.
And it seems to me that speaks to exactly the neoliberal regime we're talking about as having this enormous influence over public institutions, and especially in public higher education. At CUNY, it's a running joke. We have 10 years ago, our vaunted administration decided that the thing we needed to do was have an integrated computer system to deal with all kinds of administrative and academic things. And of course, what did they do? They went out and did a private contract, and they basically signed a contract with PeopleSoft, which was, one of the things that was out there. This is not a number I'm making up. This is actually a number. It cost City University $750 million to implement what is called CUNY First. And there was massive amounts of expertise within the CUNY system among the faculty and among the staff who could have done that for 20% of that, 10% of that, 5% of that total, and come up with a functioning system that we needed. But no, they wanted to privatize it. And now what I love is 10 years later, they're saying, we think we might need to replace that. So $750 million.
Yep. Bad contracts. Yeah.
Yes. That's the way administrators think. The first thing they think of, just like business, is let's go to an outside consultancy to figure out what we need to do. And this has been a history at CUNY going back decades.
This is a time to take cues from where we see really innovative stuff happening around the country. I just want to point out that Oregon State University has had a problem with the hiring a president who is not corrupt and doing a good job. They've recently had to fire one. And what they're doing now is they're proposing the same kind of, I see in the chat, search that they always do, which is managed by consultants, outsiders. They're doing a people's search. The union there is taking on their own search for president. It's going to be in parallel, and they're doing a people's search. Just to show the challenge, just to show the difference, to highlight the values that the people who work and study at the university have in imagining what their leadership looks like, as compared to what this consultancy is doing. What the outcome of this is, they'll hire the one the consultant does. But for us to demonstrate where our interests are, for us to demonstrate what we care about, for us to actually mimic the process, this is one of these possibilities of organizing an action that we can take that might actually sort of demonstrate the rejection of this consultancy model.
It's actually a really good idea what they're doing, because it hits at the other aspect of this, which is, I know professors don't think about this because you don't think about yourself as workers, generally speaking. And it's about power.
It's about power.
It's about power. Like, of course you follow the money. I mean, and see it, but it's also about power. Like, you don't want your workers. I mean, think about it in the classic sense. Why would a boss go to his or her workers to have the workers set up a software system that the workers know how it runs, that the workers in fact can get on the inside and manipulate, and then hand it or even sell it, at a price to their bosses or for some additional fee. Like, you, as a boss, you want something that your employees are, held in awe of or controlled by, not something that your workers control. So people forget this. People don't think in those terms, right? I mean, right? I work at a large Research One institution. You don't think they have a bevy of economists that could figure out how to invest their money? No, they spend 4% of their nearly $5 billion a year on on consultants, which is like 5 times what they spend for all of their adjuncts' wages combined. They know what they're doing. They know you want to outsource that kind of thing because that's too much power to concede to a workforce to hand over that kind of, designing the software that's going to run the whatever. They're not going to do that without being forced, because there's a question of power that we don't think about as intense. They're so much more class conscious than the people whom they employ, and that's something that we have to change.
Yeah.
That made it quite simple. All right. So how have higher ed sort of New Deal efforts, bargaining for the common good efforts, work to build coalitions? So the sort of nuts and bolts of how that actually gets done, I think we're really interested in. So could you speak just a little bit more about how that's done?
There's the shitty approach, which is we're heading in, which is what a lot of unions have done for a long time. So we'll talk about the shitty approach, because this is what's often done. You're heading into a contract campaign. You're like, oh, I should call up the local activists and the clergy and the local social justice group around this, or the people who might be allies, and you have some sort of transactional. You get involved and bring some of your people around us, or show solidarity in some way, and then we'll do this with you. And that, I think, has been, there's a longstanding practice of that. I'm not saying that people don't do that. I'm not even saying that people do that with bad intentions. I don't think that comes out of ill intention. It comes from a narrowing and a limitation of the imagination of what it is that a real coalition and a real ongoing comradeship and working relationship needs to look like. You have to have it be much more ongoing and much more organic to what are the, I don't know what the particular issues are, but we started looking around at the fact that, as is the case for many state institutions, the cities where we are situated are generally poor and dominated by Black and Latinx people, and yet the universities that we work for doesn't necessarily, doesn't treat those communities with very much respect. What are the needs and how do we go and talk about that? We've started that conversation years ahead and actually set up and institutionalized, a sort of what we call Rutgers One, where people from the community, students, unions across the board come together regularly. This has been meeting for years and having discussions so that when there are needs, especially in this last year, mutual aid and organizing wasn't something we had to suddenly innovate. We actually already had the networks. So it meant that immediately from week one, we could actually begin to, talk to each other about what was needed and how we could support each other, and had a number of, car caravans and initiatives and demands that actually did get, COVID testing, for example, for the people in the communities that we serve. And that was one of the early things that we won, because we didn't have to wait for them to come to us. We went to the university, which actually invented the first COVID test, and said, you need to make this available to all of us, but to all the communities as well. And here's what you're going to do. We didn't have to wait for the phone call, because we knew that this had to be a demand, because these are our friends. These are the people that we know. They weren't strangers whom we were going to call once every 4 years around the time the contract was up to see what was up. And I think that those are the kind of longer terms. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily about like having a staffer assigned to that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having members. We all, if you have a union or an organization of any size, people already involved and engaged and affiliated with some of these various groupings. It's about talking to members about what it is that they care about and they're involved in, and and introducing them to the concept that the union that they're a member of, that their workplace might be integrated into that other quote unquote outside interests that they're involved in. And that's actually how we went about it. We didn't sort of just randomly call up various groups. It was organizations, churches, labor movements, whatever, that members were already engaged in, who brought us closer to it. And it's expanded from there.
I would say for us, there's a sort of a different version of this, which is how do you bring people together around a policy goal, like at the national level. And I think what we're learning is, unlike what Sherry is describing, I mean, we just sort of invented ourselves in this goal in the last year. And so it's sort of like learning and trying to build coalitions like as we are moving forward. And so, part of it is just surveying the landscape, like who else really cares about similar issues in higher ed. And so, people who are in the debt world care a very great deal about it, and they care about other kinds of debt too, but they care a lot about student debt. And so organizing around that, people who work on anti-racism care a lot about what anti-racist work looks like in higher ed and the debt load of Black and Brown students, right? There's a lot of potential sort of allies out there who are working in worlds that care about these things and trying to figure out who they are and how we might start conversations with them about why they could, take a look more at higher ed, and we can take a much, wider look at the things that they care about as well. But I think there's another question at the union level. So at the launch of the New Deal for Higher Education, we had people speak from staff unions, students, and it was sort of like a wonderful open and showcased our commitments to thinking about the entire university community. At the same time, I'm really realizing that there's a lot that we all have to learn from one another about what they think the university really should look like in a way that does the best by them. So we might all agree to broad strokes of direct federal funding and of preventing layoffs and things like that, but there are other things. And there are also, honestly, if we are really honest with each other, there are relationships on campus communities that are tough. Too often staff feel overlooked and underappreciated by faculty and sometimes by students as well. Tenured faculty in particularly are notoriously unaware or uninterested in the problems of contingent labor, which I think they just see as, ancillary to their own work. Graduate students seeking, organizing rights and protections, find themselves in difficult relationships sometimes with not just administrators, but also with faculty. And I think the truth is we have to build trust even at the community level in colleges and universities of all of us who are there and listen to one another as we do this work. And I feel acutely aware in sort of trying to build coalitions and, for example, bring more unions into the New Deal for Higher Education National Steering Committee. Wow, like what does it really look like to take seriously the interests of the staff union as compared to the overabundance of faculty we have in AUP and AFT? There are contingent faculty, of course, but like still it's different. And we really need to, I think, do a lot of listening and paying attention to one another in order to really build the trust that we need to push this forward.
Right. So we have just a little under 5 minutes left, and I guess I'll ask this question. It's how do we prevent additional funding from being used for further austerity efforts, right? Because there's getting the money in, and you did mention, Jennifer, some tying it to certain things and so on. But as we get this union support, where exactly are we directing it? So could you just talk just a little bit, each of you, about that?
I can say that the struggle at CUNY really is struggle to take back the centralized control that the central administration of CUNY grabbed for itself over the last 15 years. There used to be a much more decentralized process. The money comes essentially into the university from two basic sources, 2/3 from the state of New York and 1/3 from the city of New York. City funds the community colleges, state funds the senior colleges as part of the deal that I was talking about in 1976 when we lost tuition, free tuition. So one of the real struggles has to be to claw back, literally, the power to determine how that budget is expended on a local basis from the central administration. It's become a giant bureaucracy. I don't know how it works at Rutgers. I suspect there's probably something similar. But we're 25 campuses, we're the third biggest public university system in the United States. And by far, CUNY is the largest urban public university. So it's a very tough model or tough nut to crack, because in effect, there was a logic in why, centralized power happens. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take the union. It's going to take faculty governance. It's going to take students. And it feels to me like there needs to be a little bit of a confrontational style with the Board of Trustees to in effect, who serve at the pleasure of the governor and the mayor. And they are, to be blunt, hacks politically. They're there to do the bidding, especially of the governor, who gets to pick 10 of the 15, and the mayor gets to pick 5. So the biggest thing that we can do is get Andrew Cuomo out of office, and then that'll be a start towards, clawing back some of this power. It's not the total answer by any means, but he has run roughshod over the city university in his entire tenure as governor of New York State.
So as part of this learning process, one of the things that happened back in April and May is Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Education started arguing that the stimulus funding that was very much needed for higher education, and which higher education did not receive in proportion to the work that it does in this country, nevertheless needed to have strings attached to it. That did not happen. So all of the stimulus money, and it didn't even happen in the latest Biden round, right? The money just comes. Now, half of it has to go to students. We know that. It goes like directly to students for student aid. But this institutional money has no strings attached to it. And in theory, you can go add, 200,000 seats in stadiums with the money that you received from the stimulus package. So there is a question again, how do we keep it from being spent in the wrong way? If we're going to imagine that there's going to be additional federal funding for higher education, it's getting the rules written in early and what that legislation looks like and what the rules are surrounding it. That should happen in addition at the state level too. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it, I think, is to think about this university governance structure and increasing the impact of students, staff, and faculty on the university governance structure and making the budgeting decisions. But I'll say that the third place to do it is to fight it out over whatever budgeting structure, whatever budgeting tool your university is using. So we're fighting over responsibility-centered management at our university right now, which is anyone who's studied their budgetary system at their university knows that to talk about power, Sherry, the point is just that that they can be able to use the money however they want. There's a system set up, but there's always a bypass for the way they want to use the money. But really getting in and educating one another and your other faculty members, your colleagues about how those work and why they actually don't make any logical sense and why they're not really sort of saving money and introducing responsibility. I think that's another place where you can push with really interesting results. Almost everyone we've educated at Rutgers about responsibility-centered management comes away with their mind blown and a commitment really to doing what they can to restore a much fairer and much more student and instructional centered approach to budgeting.
I guess the only thing I add to that, because I think we have to expose, I think we have to educate, we have to agitate around this. I mean, it just concretely around like this budgeting model, which I've always called like an eat what you kill system. It's ridiculous. It's like poetry has to justify itself. It's ridiculous. You know, be entrepreneurial. Fuck you. The reality is that there's ways of agitating around things even as boring as budgets. If you know, I mean, at least with public institutions, we can access what the numbers are. One of the clever things, for example, Juan Gonzalez is a member of our union. People are familiar with who he is. He's on Democracy Now! In the morning. He's one of the founding members of the Young Lords. He's also very active in his union. One of the things he's very creative. He teaches investigative reporting at Rutgers. I'm sure the bosses regret that hire a million times over. But he has the students there now. His students are now canvassing their peers about how they went ahead and tapped into the CARES money. And it's becoming a problem because a lot of them are going, what CARES money? What do you mean I had access to this money? And this becomes a way of agitating and also bringing, you know, faculty together with a very potent force on every campus, which is the students. And if the students aren't riled up, because even when the administration isn't quite sure how they feel about the faculty, we certainly know that they can't make the place run without students. And so I think things like that become, you know, I mean, I'm surprised we have hundreds of people who come out to some of the budget things that we've done where we expose it. I mean, you know, you be a little clever about how you do it, but it actually has had an impact in forcing them to reallocate funds. Look, we got, you know, last kind of $20 million suddenly appeared for race and gender equity. You know, days before we, you know, were on the brink of the first ever strike in 253 year history of Rutgers. You know, this is there, you know, budgets, as we are reminded by our lefty audit friends, begin with a B and end with an S. These are not handed down from God. These are creations of people who are diddling with the, you know, with the dollars, and we have to call them out, and it has to start by exposing it broadly and giving people a sense of what they might demand differently. And we know it doesn't conform to the rules. There's some of these things are going to be codified later in policy after having been demanded for and won on the ground. That's just my read of how these things often go.
Well, under the right conditions, budgets can be very exciting things. Thank you so much, all of you. This has been a great conversation. And in the chat, I've also put a link for those of you who want to continue reading about this stuff and having discussions about this stuff. So there, you can just let us know and we will contact you. Thank you again. And we will see you all at 12:15. Have a great lunch.